71 BC, the Appian Way. The first thing you notice is not the sight, but the sound. A dense, wet chorus of 100,000 crows, their calls like black stones rattling in a skull. Then the smell hits you, a thick, sweet, and cloying blanket of decay that clings to the back of your throat, a perfume of defeat brewed under the Italian sun. And finally, you see it. Stretching from the gates of Rome all the way to Capua, a distance of over 120 miles, is a forest of wood and flesh. 6,000 crosses, planted with geometric Roman precision, line the great road. On each one, the sagging, broken form of a man, their bodies contorted in the final agonies of crucifixion, their skin a canvas of dried blood, filth, and sun blisters. This is not justice. This is a sermon delivered with hammers and nails. It is a message from the Roman Republic to the world, a lesson written in a language of absolute terror, intended to be so horrific, so monumental in its cruelty, that no slave would ever again dare to dream the dream that these men had dreamed. Travelers on the road avert their eyes, mothers cover their children's faces, but no one can escape the sheer, suffocating presence of this monument to crushed rebellion. This was the saga's end, the final brutal punctuation mark on a story that had brought the most powerful empire in the world to the very brink of annihilation. But to understand the terrifying silence that now hangs over the Appian Way, one must first understand the roar of the man who caused this forest of death to be planted. It is the narrative of him, the ghost whose body was never found among the slain, the Thracian slave who dared to teach Rome the meaning of fear. This is the narrative of him, the man they called Spartacus. His story is a violent paradox, a question that historians have wrestled with for 2 millennia. Why? Why did a single slave, a piece of property classified under Roman law as a res, a talking thing, dare to do the unthinkable? It was not merely a riot, it was a war. It was not just a bid for freedom, it was a direct challenge to the foundations of civilization as the Romans knew it. To understand this man, we must return to the world that spawned him and the central, dramatic question his life poses. How could a man with nothing, a gladiator destined to die for the entertainment of others, rise up to command an army of over 100,000 souls and threaten the very heart of an empire that had conquered the known world? Was he a military genius, a proto-revolutionary, a butcher, or a messiah for the oppressed? The Romans, like the historian Appian, saw him as a monster, a barbarian whose inexplicable military talent was a terrifying anomaly. Later thinkers, from Plutarch to the Enlightenment philosophers, saw a noble figure, a righteous warrior fighting against an evil system. Karl Marx would elevate him to the status of a proletarian hero, the most splendid fellow in the whole of ancient history. But these are all echoes, interpretations layered upon a ghost. The truth is far more complex and far more human. The saga of Spartacus is not merely a story of rebellion. It is a story about how extreme oppression can forge an extraordinary leader, and how the taste of victory can transform the desire for escape into a revolutionary vision so audacious it borders on madness. His tale is a mirror held up to Rome itself, reflecting the deep, festering wounds that lay hidden beneath its marble facade of law, order, and imperial glory. To understand Spartacus, one must first understand the world he sought to tear down. The Roman Republic in the 1st century BC. It was not a stable monolith of power, but a global superpower in the throes of a profound and violent identity crisis, a pressure cooker with the lid screwed on tight. The Republic's eagle standards cast a long shadow from the Pillars of Hercules in Spain to the shores of the Black Sea. But this vast expansion had come at a terrible price. Its greatest legions, the very instruments of its power, were perpetually engaged in brutal wars on the periphery. In the east, the brilliant general Lucius Licinius Lucullus was locked in a seemingly endless struggle against the elusive king Mithridates VI of Pontus. In the west, the young and ambitious Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, later known as Pompey the Great, was just finishing a bloody, decade-long war against the renegade Roman general Quintus Sertorius in Spain. This meant that the Italian heartland, the domus of the Republic, was stripped of its best and most experienced troops, left guarded by undertrained militias and the private ambitions of its ruling class. Internally, Roman society was a pyramid of staggering inequality. A tiny oligarchic class, men like Marcus Licinius Crassus, controlled immense fortunes and vast agricultural estates. The latifundia, which were worked by hundreds of thousands of slaves captured in Rome's foreign wars. These slaves, treated as human livestock, had displaced the free Italian farmer, who now flocked to Rome to become a volatile, unemployed urban mob, dependent on the state's grain dole and the violent political theater of the Forum. The political system itself was poisoned by the recent memory of the civil wars between Gaius Marius and Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a conflict that had seen Roman citizens slaughter each other in the streets and normalized the practice of political prescription, state-sanctioned murder lists. This was a world of extreme wealth and abject misery, of limitless power and absolute subjugation. It was a society built upon the foundational belief in the natural order of master and slave, a belief so absolute that the very idea of a coordinated slave uprising, a bellum servile, was not just a military threat, but a form of cosmic horror. This brutal, glittering, and deeply fractured world was the forge, and it was about to produce a man of fire and steel. The man who would become the symbol of this cataclysm was not born a revolutionary. He was a product of the frontiers, a Thracian, from a region known to the Romans for its fierce, warlike tribes and its deep-seated hatred of foreign domination. The Greco-Roman writers who chronicled his life, like Plutarch and Appian, are sparse on the details of his early years, but they agree on his origins and hint at a critical piece of his past that would prove instrumental in his future success. It is widely believed that Spartacus was not always a slave. He may have first encountered Rome as a soldier, serving as an auxiliary in the Roman army. This is the crucial, defining element of his biography. Unlike the vast majority of slaves toiling on the latifundia or in the mines, Spartacus knew the enemy from the inside. He had likely marched in a maniple, understood the function of the centurion's vine staff, witnessed the brutal efficiency of Roman logistics, and learned the tactical doctrines that had made the legions invincible. He understood their strengths: discipline, engineering, relentless pressure, and their weaknesses. But at some point, his path diverged. Whether he deserted, as some sources suggest, or was captured after his tribe resisted Roman expansion, the result was the same. He went from being a cog in the Roman war machine to being its fuel. Captured and deemed strong and defiant, he was sold. Not into the relative anonymity of a farm or a mine, but into a fate arguably worse: the ludus, the gladiator school. He was sent to Capua, to the infamous school of Lentulus Batiatus, a place where human beings were systematically broken down and remade into living weapons for public spectacle. Here, in the acrid stench of sweat, blood, and fear, surrounded by other condemned men, Gauls, Germans, fellow Thracians, His military past was perversely honed into a deadly art form. The forge of the Thracian hills gave him his warrior spirit. The Roman auxiliary service gave him his military education. But it was the bloody sand of the Capuan ludus that tempered him into the weapon that would be aimed at the heart of the Republic. The cataclysm did not begin with a grand proclamation or a strategic masterstroke. It began, as most desperate acts do, with the mundane and the visceral. It started in the year 73 BC, in the suffocating confines of the Gladiator school in Capua, a city known for its wealth and luxury, built on the backs of men like Spartacus. The plot was simple, born of whispers in the dark, a pact made between men who had nothing to lose but the few breaths left to them before they were sent to the arena. The chroniclers report that around 200 gladiators were in on the plan. But betrayal is the currency of desperate men, and the plot was discovered. Faced with imminent discovery and certain torture and execution, Spartacus and a small group of his closest followers chose to act rather than wait for the inevitable. They did not have swords or shields. Their revolution began in a kitchen. Seizing cleavers, knives, and roasting spits, they fought their way out of their cells, a raw, primal explosion of violence. They overwhelmed their guards in a chaotic, bloody struggle, the first of many. Once on the streets of Capua, their luck held. They stumbled upon a wagon carrying a shipment of gladiatorial weapons. The very tools of their enslavement now became the instruments of their liberation. Arming themselves, this small band of around 78 men, led by Spartacus, Crassus, and Oenomaus, fought their way out of the city. They were a pathetic sight. A handful of escaped slaves, armed with stage weapons, with the entire Roman state apparatus soon to be arrayed against them. They fled to the most defensible position they could find nearby, the dormant crater of Mount Vesuvius. This act, born of pure desperation, was the spark. It should have been extinguished quickly, a minor footnote in the annals of Roman law enforcement. But this spark had landed on a vast, dry forest of human misery, and in the shadow of the volcano, a fire was about to be lit that would consume all of Italy. What drove this man? What was the inner fire that transformed a desperate fugitive into the commander of a legendary army? To answer this is to step into the realm of psychological reconstruction. For the Roman historians, who are our only sources, were incapable of truly understanding the mind of a slave who dared to defy them. For them, his motivations were simple: barbaric bloodlust and a lust for plunder. But the reality must have been far more complex. The initial driving force was undoubtedly the most powerful human instinct of all: survival. The breakout from Capua was a choice between two kinds of death: a quick one fighting for freedom, or a slow, agonizing one in the arena or on a cross. On the slopes of Vesuvius, the primary goal was simply to live to see another day. However, as the rebellion began to succeed, as news of their incredible victory over the first Roman force sent against them spread like wildfire, something profound began to shift. The ranks of the fugitives swelled with a torrent of humanity. Runaway slaves from the surrounding estates, shepherds, dispossessed farmers, all the wretched of the earth flocked to his banner. Spartacus was no longer just a leader of gladiators. He was the reluctant king of a growing nation of the damned. It is at this point that his motivation likely evolved. The desire for simple freedom, to escape Italy and return to their homelands in Thrace or Gaul, was now fused with a new, terrifying emotion: vengeance. Every new recruit brought with them a story of horrific abuse, of families torn apart, of endless labor under the lash. The rebellion became a vessel for a century of pent-up hatred. But was there something more? The title of this story poses the question of a dream to free the world. While he almost certainly never held such a modern, universalist ideology, his actions suggest a dawning vision of something more than mere escape. He enforced a policy of sharing all plunder equally. He forbade the use of gold and silver in his camp, and he attempted to forge a disciplined army from a chaotic mob. It was a vision of a new, egalitarian society, a world turned upside down. This transformation, from survival to vengeance to a nascent revolutionary project, was the true inner fire that fueled the Great Rebellion. The initial success of the breakout from Capua and the seizure of a defensible position on Mount Vesuvius would have meant nothing if the leadership had fractured. The force that fled to the volcano's crater was not a homogeneous unit. It was a volatile mix of ethnicities, languages, and temperaments, a microcosm of the vast slave empire Rome had created. Plutarch tells us that from the beginning, 3 men stood at the forefront: Spartacus, the Thracian, and 2 Gauls, Crassus and Oenomaus. This was the first council of war, a brotherhood of the damned forged in the crucible of Batiatus's ludus. Spartacus, with his probable experience in the Roman military, was the natural strategist, the cool head. He understood that their only hope lay in discipline, mobility, and exploiting Roman arrogance. Crassus, by contrast, embodied the raw, furious heart of the rebellion. He was a warrior who represented the deep-seated desire among many of the Gauls and Germans for immediate, brutal revenge against their former masters. His vision was not one of strategic escape, but of a great, avenging horde that would burn and pillage its way through the Italian heartland. Oenomaus, another Gaul, was a key commander in the early days, though he would fall in battle early in the conflict, a testament to the brutal attrition rate of their war. This triumvirate formed a fragile alliance, a delicate balance between strategic thinking and raw fury. In the beginning, their shared hatred of Rome was enough to bind them together. They were united by their chains. They understood that their initial band of 78 gladiators would be crushed unless they could transform their rage into a cohesive fighting force. On Vesuvius, they began the impossible task of turning a mob of desperate men into an army, a task made possible only by the unique blend of leadership they possessed. Spartacus provided the mind, Crassus the spirit, and together they represented a threat far greater than the sum of its parts. This initial unity was their greatest strength, but the seeds of their eventual destruction were already present in the fundamental differences between their ultimate goals. The news of the breakout and the establishment of a rebel camp on Vesuvius was met with contemptuous dismissal in both Capua and Rome. This was a police matter, not a war. The Senate dispatched a praetor, Gaius Claudius Glaber, with a hastily assembled militia of about 3,000 men, not legionaries, but raw recruits considered sufficient to crush a band of runaway slaves. Glaber, embodying the lethal arrogance of the Roman elite, did not even bother to fortify his camp with a proper wall and trench. He simply blocked the only known path down the volcano, content to wait for hunger and thirst to finish the job for him. It was here, in the shadow of Vesuvius, that Spartacus demonstrated the tactical brilliance that would become his hallmark. He turned the mountain into a weapon. His men gathered the wild vines that clung to the slopes and wove them into long, sturdy ladders. Under the cover of darkness, while Glaber's men slept, the slave army descended silently down a sheer cliff face on the opposite side of the mountain. They fell upon the Roman camp from the rear with a terrifying fury. The attack was a complete rout. The Roman militia, shocked and unprepared, was slaughtered. This victory was more than just a military success. It was a powerful piece of propaganda. The slaves had not just defeated a Roman force, they had humiliated it, using ingenuity to overcome brute strength. The psychological impact was immense. Weapons, supplies, and most importantly, a reputation were gained. The victory at Vesuvius was the true birth of the Spartan army. The trickle of runaway slaves joining their cause became a flood. Shepherds, herdsmen, and field hands, strong, hardy men brutalized by life on the latifundia, abandoned their masters and flocked to the banner of the victorious Gladiator. This ghost army, born from nothing, was now armed with Roman weapons and fueled by a victory that proved the impossible was possible. The price of this army was the imposition of a brutal, iron discipline, as Spartacus began the monumental task of turning a torrent of desperate souls into a force that could face the legions of Rome and survive. The name Spartacus now began to be whispered with a mixture of fear and awe across Italy. But in the marbled halls of the Roman Senate, the primary emotion was still one of indignant disbelief. The defeat of Glaber was an embarrassment, not a crisis. The antagonist of this saga, at this stage, was not a single man, but the faceless, collective arrogance of the Roman ruling class. They failed to grasp the nature of the threat because they were ideologically incapable of seeing slaves as strategic actors. To them, slaves were tools, beasts of burden. The idea that they could form a coherent army led by a brilliant tactician was simply outside their frame of reference. This was a bellum servile, a slave war, the most dishonorable and contemptible form of conflict imaginable. To send a full consular army against them would be to grant them a legitimacy they did not deserve. And so, the Senate made its second critical error. They dispatched another praetor, Publius Varinius, with a larger but still inadequate force. Spartacus, his army now swollen to tens of thousands, met this new challenge with a series of dazzling maneuvers. He defeated Varinius's lieutenants in succession, captured the praetor's own lictors and his horse, and very nearly captured Varinius himself. The rebels now controlled much of the countryside of southern Italy. They sacked towns, armed their new recruits, and began the systematic process of forging weapons. The Roman response had been reactive, clumsy, and catastrophically underestimated. The Senate was like a slumbering giant, annoyed by a fly, swatting at it lazily without realizing the fly was in fact a hornet that had just roused its entire nest. This institutional arrogance, this refusal to see the rebellion for what it was, a genuine war, gave Spartacus the most precious commodity a rebel leader could ask for: time. Time to grow, time to train, and time to transform his ghost army into a force that could no longer be dismissed. As the rebellion grew from a brushfire into a raging inferno, consuming much of southern Italy, the first serious cracks began to appear within its leadership. The very success of the slave army became the catalyst for its first great internal crisis. The fragile alliance forged on Vesuvius between Spartacus the Thracian and Crassus the Gaul was put to the test. Their fundamental disagreement over the rebellion's ultimate objective now erupted into an open schism. Spartacus, the strategist, had a clear and logical grand plan. Use their victories to march north, punch through the Roman forces guarding the passes, and cross the Alps to freedom. Once over the mountains, the great slave army could disperse, with the Gauls returning to Gaul, the Germans to Germania, and the Thracians to Thrace. It was a plan for escape and survival. Crassus, however, was animated by a different vision. He and his followers, primarily Gauls and Germans, who harbored a deep, ancestral hatred for Rome, had tasted victory and plunder. They had humiliated their former masters and grown rich on the spoils of the Italian countryside. The idea of simply leaving was anathema to them. They wanted more. They wanted revenge. Their goal was not to escape Italy, but to march on Rome itself. This was the fatal crack, the first psychological breaking point for the rebellion. According to the historian Appian Crassus, at the head of a force of some 30,000 men, broke away from the main army to pursue his own campaign of plunder. This act was a catastrophic strategic blunder. It divided their forces in the face of a now fully alerted enemy and exposed the rebellion's greatest vulnerability, its lack of a unified political goal. Spartacus understood that their army, a diverse collection of different peoples, was a military instrument, not a nascent state. It could be held together by the promise of freedom, but it would be torn apart by the lure of vengeance and greed. The sundering of the host was the first indication that defeating the Roman legions might be easier than conquering the demons of hatred and division within their own ranks. The rebellion's astonishing early success was not solely due to the genius of Spartacus or the failures of the Roman praetors. It was also a matter of perfect timing, a direct consequence of the Republic's imperial overstretch. Spartacus and his followers had risen up in a moment of unique Roman vulnerability, exploiting a power vacuum in the Italian peninsula that had been created by distant wars. The Roman war machine was a global enterprise, and its sharpest teeth were chewing on flesh thousands of miles from home. The Republic's two most formidable generals were deeply entangled in complex and brutal campaigns. In the east, Lucullus was prosecuting a difficult war against Mithridates of Pontus, a clever and resilient enemy who had defied Rome for decades. This campaign consumed a massive portion of Rome's military resources and finest legions. Meanwhile, in the west, Pompey the Great was concluding a grueling and savage war in Spain against the Marian remnant led by Sertorius. The Spanish campaign had been a bloody quagmire, a war of sieges and ambushes that had also tied up a huge number of veteran legions. The Senate simply did not have a first-rate army available in Italy to immediately dispatch against the slave revolt. The forces they did have were either garrison troops, new recruits, or legions of questionable quality. Spartacus, with his own experience as a Roman auxiliary, would have understood this strategic reality perfectly. He knew that the legendary legions were far away, and that the forces sent against him were second-rate. He used this window of opportunity with breathtaking skill, using the time to grow his army from a few dozen fugitives into a force of over 100,000, to train them, arm them, and win a series of victories that built up their morale and experience. It was as if a fire had broken out in the heart of a great mansion, while the master of the house and his best guards were busy fighting intruders on the far ends of the estate. The chaos on the periphery gave the fire in the center the time it needed to become an uncontrollable blaze. By the spring of the year 72 BC, the Roman Senate could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. The fire was out of control. With the praetors defeated and all of southern Italy in chaos, they finally acknowledged the unthinkable. This was a war. They took the extraordinary step of dispatching both of that year's consuls, Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus, each with 2 full legions, to crush the rebellion. This was the moment of truth. The slave army would now face not militias, but the professional, battle-hardened soldiers of the Republic. It was at this juncture that the fatal split with Crassus had its consequences. Gellius's legions cornered Crassus and his 30,000 followers near Mount Garganus. The battle was a slaughter. Crassus, fighting bravely, was killed, and 2/3 of his army were annihilated. Hearing the news, Spartacus must have understood that he was next. But instead of retreating, he turned his tactical genius into an instrument of sublime revenge. He first maneuvered against the consul Lentulus, who was descending from the Apennines in an attempt to encircle him. Using the terrain to his advantage, Spartacus ambushed and decisively defeated Lentulus's army. Then, in a brilliant feat of speed and strategy, he turned and marched against Gellius, who was moving north in pursuit. He caught Gellius's legions off guard and inflicted another crushing defeat upon them. In a matter of weeks, a half-trained slave army had done the unthinkable. It had defeated both Roman consuls in open battle. The psychological shock in Rome was profound. This was a humiliation on a scale not seen in Italy since the days of Hannibal. To commemorate his victory and honor the fallen Crassus, Spartacus staged a chilling spectacle. He forced 300 Roman prisoners to fight to the death as gladiators, a grim and brutal inversion of the Roman order. The slave who was meant to die for Rome's entertainment now made Romans die for his. He was no longer a rebel. He was a conqueror. He stood at a precipice, not of a cliff, but of history. With 2 consular armies shattered and the road north lying open, Spartacus had achieved his primary strategic objective. The Alps, and the freedom that lay beyond them, were within his grasp. His original plan was on the verge of success. This was the peak of his power, the zenith of the rebellion. His army, now numbering somewhere close to 120,000 men, women, and children, was a mobile nation, hardened by battle and emboldened by a string of impossible victories. They had met the best forces Rome could currently muster in Italy and broken them. At this moment, Spartacus was arguably the most powerful man on the peninsula, and it was here, at this moment of ultimate triumph, that he made the most debated and mysterious decision of his life. He turned back. He abandoned the march on the Alps and led his vast host south again. Why? This is the psychological heart of the Spartacus enigma. The Roman historians, writing from a perspective of utter incomprehension, suggest it was a fit of hubris, that Spartacus, puffed up by his victories, now entertained the insane notion of marching on Rome itself. A more charitable interpretation, offered by Plutarch, is that his own army refused to go. Flushed with victory and laden with plunder, his warriors, particularly the Gauls and Germans who remained, had no desire to undertake a grueling march across the mountains when the riches of Italy lay at their feet. They had come for vengeance and wealth, not just escape. Perhaps Spartacus, a leader who ruled by consent rather than by absolute authority, was forced to bow to the will of his followers. Or perhaps a third possibility exists, that the vision had changed. Perhaps Spartacus himself, having defeated consuls and humbled the Republic, began to believe in a new destiny. Maybe the dream was no longer just to get home, but to build a new one, to break the Roman state and create something new from its ashes. Whatever the reason, this decision to turn south was the rebellion's point of no return. It transformed a war of liberation into a direct existential challenge to Rome, a challenge the Republic would have to answer with all its might. The repeated, humiliating defeats of consular armies finally shocked the Roman Senate out of its complacency and into a state of cold, calculated fear. The crisis required a new kind of response and a new kind of man. The political chaos in Rome provided just such a figure, waiting in the wings for his opportunity. His name was Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was the wealthiest man in Rome, Having amassed an obscene fortune through real estate speculation, silver mining, and, most notoriously, by running a private fire brigade that would only put out fires if the owner of the burning building agreed to sell it to him at a knockdown price. But wealth was not enough for Crassus. He craved what he could not buy: military glory, a triumph, the ultimate status symbol for a Roman aristocrat. He watched with burning envy as his great rival, Pompey the Great, earned glory in Spain. The war against Spartacus, a conflict that every other senator viewed as a dishonorable and thankless task, was, for Crassus, a golden opportunity. He volunteered for the command, offering to raise and equip new legions at his own expense. The desperate Senate agreed, granting him the praetorship and supreme command. Crassus was the perfect antithesis to Spartacus. Where Spartacus was a slave with nothing, Crassus was an oligarch who owned a significant portion of the republic. Where Spartacus led through charisma and shared victory, Crassus would lead through terror and iron discipline. He was not a military genius on the level of Pompey or Caesar, but he was methodical, ruthless, and understood the psychology of power. The first thing he did upon taking command was to reintroduce the ancient and brutal punishment of decimation. When one of his legions broke in the face of the slave army, he had the cohort responsible divided into groups of 10 and forced the men to draw lots. 1 in every 10, 500 soldiers in total, were then clubbed to death by their own comrades. The message was clear and chilling. You may fear the enemy, but you will fear your own commander more. The war had a new protagonist, and the final bloody act was about to begin. While Crassus was forging his new army through terror, the force he was preparing to face was one of the strangest military phenomena in history. The Spartan host was not merely an army. It was a mobile society, a nation on the march, with all the logistical and social complexities that entailed. At its peak, it may have numbered over 120,000 people, but only a fraction of these were effective combatants. The rest were a vast baggage train of women, children, the elderly, and the infirm, the families of the rebels and the thousands of camp followers who had joined them. This immense, slow-moving column was both a source of strength and a critical weakness. It provided a cause to fight for beyond mere plunder, a reason to create a new world rather than just destroy the old one. But it also severely hampered the army's mobility, the very quality that had given Spartacus his early advantages. The logistical challenges were staggering. Feeding such a multitude required constant foraging and plunder. The army had its own blacksmiths, working day and night to turn stolen iron and captured armor into weapons. Shepherds who had only ever held a crook were trained to wield a sword. Field hands who knew only the scythe learned to form a shield wall. Spartacus attempted to impose a form of primitive communism, forbidding any individual from holding gold or silver and ensuring that all spoils were distributed equally. This was a radical act, a direct repudiation of the greed-fueled hierarchy of Roman society. He was trying to forge a new culture in the heat of war. He understood that to keep this volatile mix of Gauls, Germans, Thracians, and Italians united, he needed to give them more than just hatred for Rome. He needed to give them a shared identity and a sense of justice. This sun city on the move, as some later philosophers would imagine it, was a desperate, brilliant, and ultimately doomed attempt to build a new society while the old one was trying to exterminate it. Within this vast, moving nation, the human element was a constant, volatile factor that shaped the rebellion's destiny. The historical sources, focused as they are on battles and generals, rarely give us a glimpse of the ordinary people who made up the bulk of the Spartan host, but their presence was the defining feature of the war. The thousands of women and children in the baggage train were a constant logistical burden, but they were also the heart of the rebellion, the very reason many of the men were fighting. They were not just dependents. They were active participants, tending to the wounded, preparing food, and maintaining the social fabric of the mobile community. Among these women was one figure who emerges briefly from the shadows of history, the wife of Spartacus. Plutarch mentions her, a Thracian woman who was said to be a prophetess of the cult of Dionysus. He writes that she interpreted the sign of a snake coiling around the sleeping Spartacus's face as a portent of his great and terrible destiny. Her presence suggests a spiritual and charismatic dimension to Spartacus's leadership that went beyond mere military command. She may have been instrumental in maintaining morale, in framing their struggle not just as a war for freedom, but as a divinely sanctioned crusade. At the same time, the ethnic diversity that gave the army its size was a constant source of internal friction. The deep-seated rivalries between Gauls and Germans, the different languages, customs, and martial traditions were always simmering beneath the surface. Spartacus had to be more than a general. He had to be a diplomat, a judge, and a high priest, constantly managing the delicate egos and ancient hatreds of his followers. It was a monumental balancing act, holding together a coalition of the desperate, knowing that a single major defeat could shatter their fragile unity and dissolve the army back into a terrified mob. The new commander, Crassus, eschewed the reckless frontal assaults that had led his predecessors to ruin. He was a strategist of attrition, and his plan was coldly, brutally logical. After a series of initial skirmishes, he managed to maneuver Spartacus's army into the toe of Italy, the peninsula of Bruttium in the far south. It was here that Crassus unveiled his grand and terrible design. He put his legions to work, not with swords, but with shovels. Across the narrowest point of the peninsula, from the Tyrrhenian to the Ionian Sea, his soldiers began to construct a monument to Roman engineering and implacable will, a wall. It was a ditch and rampart stretching for over 37 miles, 15 feet deep and 15 feet wide, reinforced with a continuous palisade and guarded by a series of forts. The project was completed with breathtaking speed, a testament to the discipline Crassus had instilled in his troops. The slave army was now trapped. The wall blocked any escape to the north, while the sea surrounded them on three sides. Crassus's strategy was simple: to wait. He would let winter, starvation, and despair do the work of his legions. The first cracks in the rebellion, which had appeared during the split with Crassus, now became a gaping chasm. Trapped and with supplies dwindling, morale within the slave army plummeted. The vast baggage train of non-combatants became an anchor of famine, consuming their precious food reserves. The psychological pressure was immense. Every day, the rebels could look north and see the impassable line of the wall, a symbol of Rome's limitless resources and relentless patience. Spartacus, the master of mobility and surprise, had been outmaneuvered and cornered. The war of movement was over, and a slow, agonizing siege had begun. The hunter had become the hunted. Trapped in the desolate landscape of Bruttium, with winter closing in and starvation gnawing at his army, Spartacus made his last, most desperate gamble. His gaze turned to the sea. The nearby island of Sicily, a hotbed of previous slave revolts and a major source of Roman grain, seemed like a perfect sanctuary and a new base of operations. To get there, he needed ships, At that time, the Mediterranean was plagued by the Cilician pirates, powerful and well-organized fleets that operated as a quasi-independent naval power. They were enemies of Rome, and as the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. Spartacus managed to make contact with the pirates and struck a deal. For a substantial sum from the rebellion's treasury of plunder, they would provide the ships to ferry his army across the Strait of Messina to Sicily. Hope, for a brief moment, surged through the desperate camp. Escape seemed possible once more. Thousands of rebels prepared for the evacuation, gathering by the coast, waiting for the sails that would deliver them from Crassus's trap. And then came the crushing, final betrayal. The pirates took the payment and simply sailed away. They had never had any intention of honoring the deal. Whether they were bribed by Crassus or simply decided that taking the treasure without the risk of transporting a slave army was a better business decision, the result was the same. The rebels were left stranded on the beach, staring at an empty sea. This was perhaps the greatest psychological blow of the entire war. They had been outwitted not by Roman legions, but by the greed of fellow outlaws. The betrayal of the pirates extinguished the last glimmer of hope for a strategic escape. There was no way out. The wall of Crassus was in front of them, the sea was behind them, and the full weight of Roman vengeance was about to descend. The betrayal by the pirates left Spartacus with only one terrifying option: to fight his way out. On a dark and stormy winter night, under the cover of a blizzard, a portion of the slave army launched a surprise assault on Crassus's wall. In a feat of desperate ingenuity, they filled a section of the ditch with earth, wood, and the bodies of prisoners and animals, creating a bridge over which they could cross. They broke through. About a third of the army managed to escape the trap and were once again free in the Italian countryside. But it was a hollow victory. The army was fractured, starving, and demoralized. It was at this moment of weakness that the Roman political machine intervened once more. The Senate, impatient with Crassus's slow progress and terrified by the news that Spartacus was once again on the loose, decided to recall Pompey the Great from Spain and Marcus Lucullus from Thrace, along with their veteran legions, to finally put an end to the war. For Crassus, this was a nightmare. He was on the verge of victory, and now the glory was about to be stolen by his hated rival Pompey. Determined to finish the war himself, he pursued Spartacus relentlessly. A significant detachment of the slave army, led by Gannicus and Castus, broke away from the main force and was cornered and annihilated by Crassus. The end was near. Spartacus, his army now cornered in Lucania, with Crassus closing from one side and the legions of Pompey and Lucullus marching to intercept him from the others, had no choice left but to turn and fight. He made his stand near the headwaters of the Salarius River in the spring of 71 BC. The final, epic, and brutal catastrophe was at hand. He knew it was a battle they could not win, a last defiant roar against the dying of the light. The final battle was not a calculated tactical engagement. It was a paroxysm of apocalyptic fury. The two armies, the legions of Crassus and the last remnants of the great slave rebellion, faced each other across a desolate plain. Plutarch writes that as the battle was about to begin, Spartacus's men brought him his horse. He drew his sword and killed it, declaring, "If I am victorious, I will have many horses. If I am defeated, I will not need one." It was the gesture of a man who knew he was going to die and intended to do so on his feet, fighting alongside his men. The sensory assault of the battle must have been overwhelming. The air would have been filled with the deep, terrifying blare of Roman war horns, the rhythmic tramp of thousands of hobnailed sandals, and the guttural war cries of the Gauls and Germans making their final stand. The clash of the two lines would have been a hellish forge of sound and violence, the sharp crack of a pilum splintering against a shield, the wet, percussive thud of swords hitting flesh, the screams of the wounded and the dying. The disciplined Roman lines, a machine built for killing, ground forward against the desperate, chaotic ferocity of the rebels. In the midst of this maelstrom, Spartacus had one final, audacious objective. He was not trying to win the battle. He was trying to assassinate the Roman Republic in the person of its commander. With a small group of his bravest followers, he ignored the surrounding slaughter and hacked a path directly towards the command post of Marcus Licinius Crassus. He was a man possessed, a figure of singular, focused rage, cutting down two centurions who stood in his way. For a brief moment, it seemed he might reach his target, but the sheer weight of numbers was too great. He was surrounded, wounded in the thigh by a spear, and forced to fight on one knee. He continued to fight, a whirlwind of defiance, until he was finally overwhelmed and cut down, swallowed by the tide of legionaries. His body, lost in a heap of the slain, was never definitively identified. The symbol had collapsed, and with his death, the rebellion's heart stopped beating. The rest was a rout and a massacre. The battle was over, but the war was not. While Crassus had won the decisive victory, his glory was immediately tarnished. A contingent of about 5,000 rebels who had escaped the slaughter fled north, only to run directly into the legions of Pompey, who were just returning from Spain. Pompey's troops easily cut them to pieces. In a typically arrogant move, Pompey then wrote to the Senate, declaring that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in battle, he, Pompey, had extirpated the war by its roots. Crassus was denied the full military triumph he so desperately craved, having to settle for the lesser honor of an ovation, a slight that would fuel his rivalry with Pompey for years. But Crassus would have his revenge, not on Pompey, but on the memory of the rebellion itself. He still had 6,000 prisoners, captured after the final battle. For these survivors, a fate far worse than a quick death in combat awaited. Crassus conceived of a final act of psychological warfare, a spectacle of state terror designed to be so vast and so gruesome that it would be seared into the collective memory of the slave population for generations. He ordered all 6,000 to be crucified. The crosses were erected along the entire length of the Appian Way, the great road connecting Rome to Capua, the very city where the rebellion had begun. It was a forest of agony, a 200-kilometer-long monument of writhing, dying men. For weeks, travelers on the road were forced to witness the slow, agonizing deaths, to hear the endless chorus of groans and curses, and to breathe the stench of death. This was the hero's finale, an ending not of noble death, but of calculated, industrial-scale cruelty. It was Rome's final statement, its brutal and unequivocal answer to the slave who had dared to challenge its authority. It was a message that power, in the end, belonged not to the dreamers, but to those who had the most crosses. The crucifixion of 6,000 men should have been the end of the story, the final nail in the coffin of a terrifying memory. And for the Romans, it largely was. In the official histories and the minds of the ruling elite, Spartacus became a bogeyman, a cautionary tale used to justify the brutal suppression of the lower classes. He was the ultimate embodiment of barbarian fury and the chaos that would ensue if the rigid social order were ever allowed to collapse. His military brilliance was acknowledged, but only as a monstrous aberration, the terrifying exception that proved the rule of Roman supremacy. To them, he was a monster, a footnote of fear in the grand narrative of the Republic's inevitable triumph. But the name, the symbol, refused to die. While the Romans tried to bury his memory under a mountain of terror, others would resurrect it. For later generations of rebels, revolutionaries, and thinkers, Spartacus the monster became Spartacus the martyr. The enslaved people of Haiti, fighting for their freedom under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture, saw themselves as the heirs of Spartacus. The Italian nationalist Giuseppe Garibaldi, fighting to unify his country, drew inspiration from the Gladiator's struggle. For Karl Marx and subsequent socialist thinkers, he was elevated to the status of a secular saint, the leader of the first great proletarian uprising against an oppressive ruling class. In the 20th century, his name was adopted by the German communist Spartacus League and immortalized in novels and Hollywood epics. This is the great conflict of interpretations. For the civilization that killed him, he was a nightmare to be forgotten. For those who dreamed of overthrowing their own oppressors, he became a timeless and universal symbol of the fight for human dignity against overwhelming power. His physical body was never found, which only enhanced his legend. He became a ghost, an idea, and ideas are much harder to kill than men. So we return to the central paradox, the core question that has echoed through this entire saga. Why did this one man dare? What allowed a Thracian gladiator to shake the foundations of the world's greatest superpower? The final comprehensive answer is that Spartacus was not a cause, but a consequence. He was the perfect storm, a unique convergence of man, moment, and machine. First, there was the man himself. He possessed a rare combination of ferocious courage, forged in the Thracian wilderness, tactical genius, learned from within the Roman army itself, and profound charismatic leadership, honed in the death-charged atmosphere of the gladiator school. He was not just a brute. He was a brilliant strategist who repeatedly outthought Roman commanders. Second, there was the moment. He rose up at a time of the Republic's maximum weakness and distraction. The great generals were abroad. The Italian heartland was undefended, and a century of brutal conquest had created a vast, oppressed slave class that was a powder keg waiting for a spark. He was the spark. Third, and most crucially, his goal was transformed by victory. He did not begin as a revolutionary with a grand blueprint to remake the world. He began as a desperate man fighting for his own survival. But each victory brought more followers, more responsibility, and a greater sense of possibility. The initial, limited goal of escape over the Alps evolved, whether through his own ambition or the pressure of his followers, into the far grander and ultimately fatal goal of challenging Rome itself. He dared because he was the product of a system so brutal that it inadvertently trained its own nemesis. Rome taught him how to fight. It gave him a cause to fight for by enslaving him, and it created an army for him from the millions of others it had oppressed. Spartacus was the machine's ghost, the bloody blowback of empire, the living embodiment of the violence that Rome had inflicted upon the world, turned back against its creator. What then is the final verdict of history? What is the universal lesson of the life and death of Spartacus? His story is a timeless and brutal illustration of one of history's most fundamental laws. Systems of power built on dehumanization are inherently unstable. When a state classifies a group of people as res, as talking things, it does not eliminate their humanity, it merely suppresses it under immense pressure. Eventually, that pressure will find a crack, and the resulting explosion can threaten to bring the entire structure down. Spartacus demonstrates that the line between a slave and a soldier, between property and a person, is merely a social construct, one that can be violently erased by a leader with enough will and a cause with enough righteous fury. He represents the unquenchable spark of human dignity, the refusal to be an object in someone else's story. But his saga is also a tragedy. It is a lesson in the terrible arithmetic of power. His rebellion, for all its brilliance and bravery, was ultimately crushed by the superior resources, discipline, and organization of the Roman state. He could win battles, but he could not win the war against a system that could absorb catastrophic losses and still field new armies. His failure to maintain unity within his own ranks, the fatal split with Crassus, serves as a grim reminder that the oppressed are not a monolith, and that internal divisions can be as deadly as the external enemy. The ultimate verdict is this: Spartacus lost. His followers were slaughtered, and the system of slavery he fought against only grew stronger in the centuries that followed. But he won the war for narrative. He became a story, a myth, an immortal symbol of resistance that has outlived the Roman Empire itself, a testament to the idea that even in the face of certain defeat, the struggle for freedom has a power and a meaning that can never be truly extinguished. The crows have long since fallen silent on the Appian Way. The 6,000 crosses have rotted into the Italian soil, and the empire that planted them has crumbled into dust and memory. All that remains is silence. But it is a deceptive silence, the quiet of a seed buried deep in the earth. The final frame of this story is not the spectacle of death, but the persistence of a whisper. The name Spartacus, which Crassus tried so hard to erase from the world with his campaign of terror, achieved the opposite. It became immortal. It is a name whispered in slave quarters in the Caribbean, in revolutionary pamphlets in Paris, in clandestine meetings in St. Petersburg. The man is gone, lost to the chaos of his final battle, but his name became an idea, a spark passed from one generation of the oppressed to the next. It is the promise that no matter how powerful the empire, no matter how absolute its control, the human desire for freedom is a force of nature. It can be beaten, it can be crucified, and it can be buried, but it can never be truly destroyed. The shadow of the gladiator who died on his knees still stretches long from the banks of the Salarius River, a permanent and unsettling question mark at the heart of history. A reminder that the world is built on fault lines, and that sometimes all it takes is one man's defiant roar to start an earthquake. The flame he lit over Italy was extinguished, but the ember, the whisper on the road, remains, waiting for the wind.